Question 1. Benchmark analysis indicates that John Wood Group is considering a new infrastructure project to ensure responsible development and compliance with relevant regulatory frameworks. Which approach to assessing the project's potential effects would be most appropriate? Option A. Focus primarily on financial projections and a cost-benefit analysis to determine project viability. Option B. Rely on informal stakeholder feedback and anecdotal evidence to gauge potential project consequences. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment that systematically identifies, evaluates, and proposes mitigation and enhancement measures for environmental, social, and economic factors. Option D. Prioritize a rapid assessment of only the most obvious and easily quantifiable potential impacts. Correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment that systematically identifies, evaluates, and proposes mitigation and enhancement measures for environmental, social, and economic factors. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual at John Wood Group to navigate the complexities of assessing the potential impact of a new project on environmental and social factors, while adhering strictly to the regulatory framework relevant to the John Wood Group hiring assessment test. The challenge lies in identifying the most appropriate and comprehensive methodology for this assessment, ensuring it aligns with both internal company policies and external legal and ethical obligations, without resorting to overly simplistic or purely financial evaluations. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is thorough, defensible, and demonstrates a commitment to responsible project development. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves conducting a systematic and comprehensive impact assessment that considers a broad range of environmental, social, and economic factors. This approach is best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of sustainable development and corporate social responsibility, which are increasingly mandated by regulatory bodies and expected by stakeholders. Specifically, a robust impact assessment would typically involve identifying potential positive and negative effects, evaluating their significance, proposing mitigation measures for adverse impacts, and outlining enhancement strategies for positive ones. This aligns with the spirit of regulatory frameworks that aim to ensure projects are undertaken with due consideration for their broader consequences, going beyond mere compliance to proactive management of risks and opportunities. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that focuses solely on financial projections and cost-benefit analysis, while important, is insufficient. This fails to address the non-monetary environmental and social impacts that are often subject to specific regulatory oversight and ethical considerations. It represents a failure to comply with the broader mandate of impact assessment, which explicitly includes these non-financial dimensions. An approach that relies on anecdotal evidence and stakeholder opinions without a structured framework for data collection and analysis is also problematic. While stakeholder input is valuable, it needs to be integrated into a systematic assessment process. Relying solely on informal feedback can lead to biased conclusions and may not capture the full spectrum of potential impacts, potentially violating due diligence requirements. An approach that prioritizes speed and efficiency by only examining the most obvious or easily quantifiable impacts overlooks potential significant, but less apparent, consequences. This can lead to regulatory noncompliance if critical environmental or social factors are missed, and it demonstrates a lack of thoroughness that is professionally unacceptable and ethically questionable. Professional reasoning. Professionals at John Wood Group should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the scope and objectives of the impact assessment. This involves understanding the specific regulatory requirements applicable to the project and the company's internal policies. The next step is to identify and evaluate potential impacts using established methodologies that are comprehensive and evidence-based. This includes considering environmental, social, and economic dimensions. Mitigation and enhancement strategies should then be developed and integrated into the project plan. Finally, the assessment should be documented clearly and transparently, allowing for review and accountability. This structured approach ensures that all relevant factors are considered, risks are managed effectively, and the project aligns with regulatory expectations and ethical standards. Question 2. Research into the potential environmental and social consequences of a new offshore drilling project undertaken by John Wood Group in a sensitive marine ecosystem requires a robust methodology, which approach best aligns with regulatory expectations and ethical business practices for assessing these impacts. Option A, focusing primarily on the economic benefits of the project and downplaying any potential negative environmental or social effects in public communications. Option B, conducting a thorough environmental and social impact assessment (EIA) that identifies potential risks, evaluates their significance, and proposes mitigation measures with ongoing monitoring and stakeholder engagement. Option C, relying on a public relations campaign to manage public perception of the project, with minimal internal investigation into actual environmental and social impacts. Option D, outsourcing the entire impact assessment process to a third-party firm and accepting their findings without independent internal review or validation. Correct answer is B, conducting a thorough environmental and social impact assessment (EIA) that identifies potential risks, evaluates their significance, and proposes mitigation measures with ongoing monitoring and stakeholder engagement. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the company's operational needs with its legal and ethical obligations to conduct thorough due diligence. John Wood Group, as a global entity, must navigate complex regulatory landscapes, and a failure in impact assessment can lead to significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all potential impacts are identified, assessed, and mitigated effectively, aligning with the principles of responsible business conduct and regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves a comprehensive and systematic impact assessment that considers environmental, social, and economic factors. This approach is right because it directly addresses the requirements of regulatory frameworks that mandate such assessments for projects and operations. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of sustainable development and corporate social responsibility, which are increasingly embedded in legal and ethical expectations for companies like John Wood Group. By proactively identifying and evaluating potential negative consequences, the company can implement appropriate mitigation strategies, thereby fulfilling its duty of care and demonstrating adherence to best practices in risk management and compliance. An approach that focuses solely on immediate financial gains without considering broader impacts is ethically flawed and likely violates regulatory requirements for due diligence and responsible operations. Such a narrow focus disregards potential environmental damage, social unrest, or long-term economic instability, which can lead to legal liabilities and reputational harm. An approach that prioritizes public relations over substantive impact assessment is also professionally unacceptable. While managing public perception is important, it should be a consequence of genuine commitment to responsible practices, not a substitute for them. Relying on superficial communication without addressing underlying issues can be seen as misleading and can exacerbate negative consequences if impacts are later revealed. An approach that delegates the entire impact assessment process to external consultants without internal oversight, critical review risks overlooking company-specific knowledge and responsibilities. While consultants provide expertise, ultimate accountability rests with John Wood Group. A lack of internal engagement can lead to assessments that are technically sound, but not fully integrated into the company's strategic decision-making or operational realities, potentially failing to identify critical risks or mitigation opportunities. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the full scope of regulatory obligations and ethical expectations. This involves identifying all potential stakeholders and the impacts on them, gathering relevant data, and systematically evaluating risks and opportunities. The process should be iterative, allowing for adjustments based on new information or changing circumstances, and should be supported by robust internal governance and accountability mechanisms. Question 3. Process analysis reveals that a key supplier to John Wood Group, with whom the company is negotiating a significant contract renewal, has offered a senior manager a substantial personal gift, ostensibly as a gesture of goodwill. This offer is made outside of any formal company-sanctioned entertainment or hospitality event. Option A. Accept the gift discreetly, assuming it is a standard business practice and unlikely to cause any issues given the supplier's importance to John Wood Group. Option B. Accept the gift and inform the compliance department only after the contract renewal has been finalized. Option C. Consult John Wood Group's Gifts and Hospitality Policy and the UK Bribery Act 2010, seeking guidance from the company's compliance department before making any decision regarding the offer. Option D. Immediately reject the gift without any further discussion or consultation to avoid any potential perception of impropriety. The correct answer is C. Consult John Wood Group's Gifts and Hospitality Policy and the UK Bribery Act 2010, seeking guidance from the company's compliance department before making any decision regarding the offer. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure compliance with John Wood Group's internal policies and relevant UK regulatory frameworks, specifically those pertaining to financial conduct and corporate governance. The pressure to secure a contract, coupled with the offer of a personal benefit, necessitates a rigorous ethical and regulatory assessment to prevent any appearance or reality of impropriety. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between legitimate business courtesies and actions that could compromise integrity or violate regulations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of John Wood Group's gifts and hospitality policy, alongside an assessment of whether the offer constitutes a bribe or undue influence under the UK Bribery Act 2010. This approach prioritizes transparency, ethical conduct, and adherence to established company procedures and legal obligations. By seeking guidance from the compliance department and documenting the process, the individual demonstrates a commitment to upholding the highest standards of integrity and ensuring that all actions are compliant with both internal controls and external regulations. This proactive and documented approach mitigates risk and protects both the individual and the company. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves accepting the offer without further inquiry or disclosure fails to acknowledge the potential for a conflict of interest and the stringent requirements of the Bribery Act 2010. This oversight could lead to serious regulatory breaches and reputational damage for John Wood Group. An approach that involves discreetly accepting the offer and hoping it goes unnoticed is unethical and fundamentally undermines the principles of transparency and accountability. It creates a hidden risk that could have severe consequences if discovered. An approach that involves immediately rejecting the offer without understanding the nuances of the situation or consulting relevant policies might be overly cautious and could potentially miss opportunities for legitimate relationship building, provided it is done within strict ethical and regulatory boundaries. However, in this specific context, where the offer is substantial and potentially linked to a contract, a more measured approach involving consultation is prudent. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct, regulatory compliance, and company policy. This involves 1. Identifying potential conflicts of interest or ethical dilemmas. 2. Consulting relevant company policies, e.g., Gifts and Hospitality Code of Conduct. 3. Reviewing applicable laws and regulations, e.g., Bribery Act 2010. 4. Seeking advice from internal departments, e.g., compliance, legal. 5. Documenting all decisions and actions taken. 6. Acting with transparency and integrity at all times. Question 4. Comparative studies suggest that companies pursuing aggressive growth strategies often face complex regulatory hurdles. When considering a significant acquisition, how should John Wood Group best navigate the regulatory landscape to ensure compliance and ethical conduct within the UK financial services framework? Option A. Proceed with the acquisition based on a preliminary assessment of potential benefits, assuming that standard due diligence will cover all necessary regulatory checks. Option B. Prioritize securing the acquisition quickly to gain a competitive advantage, addressing any potential regulatory issues only if they are raised by authorities after the deal is complete. Option C. Interpret the existing UK financial regulations in the most favorable light for the company to expedite the acquisition process, relying on internal legal opinions. Option D. Immediately engage with legal counsel specializing in UK financial regulations to conduct a thorough review of the acquisition's compliance with all applicable laws and seek pre-clearance from relevant regulatory bodies where necessary. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the acquisition based on a preliminary assessment of potential benefits, assuming that standard due diligence will cover all necessary regulatory checks. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for rapid growth and the imperative to adhere to stringent regulatory requirements. John Wood Group, as a publicly listed entity, is subject to regulations designed to ensure market integrity and investor protection. Navigating these requirements while pursuing strategic objectives demands a nuanced understanding of compliance obligations and ethical conduct. Careful judgment is required to balance business ambitions with legal and ethical responsibilities, ensuring that growth is achieved sustainably and responsibly. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with the relevant regulatory bodies and seeking clarification on the application of specific rules to the proposed acquisition. This demonstrates a commitment to compliance and a responsible approach to corporate governance. By consulting with legal counsel specializing in the relevant jurisdiction's financial regulations and seeking pre-clearance or guidance where appropriate, John Wood Group can mitigate risks and ensure the acquisition aligns with all legal and ethical standards. This proactive stance is ethically sound as it prioritizes transparency and adherence to the law, thereby protecting stakeholders and the integrity of the financial markets. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential financial benefits without adequate regulatory due diligence would be professionally unacceptable. This failure to consider regulatory implications could lead to significant penalties, reputational damage, and even the unwinding of the acquisition. Another incorrect approach, which involves proceeding with the acquisition based on an assumption of compliance without seeking expert advice or confirmation, ignores the complexity of regulatory frameworks and the potential for misinterpretation. This can result in unintentional breaches of law. A third incorrect approach, which involves attempting to circumvent or interpret regulations in a manner that is overly favorable to the company without a clear legal basis, constitutes a serious ethical and regulatory failure, potentially leading to accusations of misconduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant regulatory obligations. This should be followed by seeking expert legal and compliance advice, conducting thorough due diligence that includes a comprehensive regulatory risk assessment, and engaging with regulators proactively when uncertainty exists. The ultimate decision should be guided by a commitment to ethical conduct and long-term sustainability, rather than short-term gains. Question 5. Cost-benefit analysis shows a significant potential profit from a new project in a region with a history of corruption. John Wood Group is considering this opportunity. Which of the following actions best reflects a responsible and compliant approach, considering the UK Bribery Act 2010? Option A. Conduct thorough due diligence on the potential client and the operating environment to identify and mitigate any bribery and corruption risks before committing to the project. Option B. Delay the project indefinitely due to the perceived risk of corruption, even though the cost-benefit analysis is favorable. Option C. Negotiate a clause in the contract that absolves John Wood Group of responsibility for any bribery that may occur during the project. Option D. Proceed with the project immediately, as the cost-benefit analysis indicates a strong financial return, and assume the client's local compliance measures are sufficient. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the project immediately, as the cost-benefit analysis indicates a strong financial return, and assume the client's local compliance measures are sufficient. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because John Wood Group, as a publicly listed company, must balance the pursuit of new business opportunities with its obligations to stakeholders and regulatory compliance. The decision to proceed with a new project, even if seemingly beneficial from a cost-benefit perspective, requires a thorough assessment of potential risks, including those related to environmental impact, ethical conduct, and adherence to the UK Bribery Act 2010. The pressure to secure new contracts can create a temptation to overlook or downplay these critical factors. The correct approach involves prioritizing due diligence and ethical considerations over immediate financial gains. This means conducting a comprehensive risk assessment that explicitly evaluates the potential for bribery and corruption associated with the new venture, particularly given the jurisdiction of the potential client. This aligns with the principles of corporate social responsibility and the specific legal requirements of the UK Bribery Act 2010, which mandates that companies take adequate procedures to prevent bribery. A proactive approach to identifying and mitigating these risks, even if it delays or alters the project, is essential for maintaining the company's reputation, avoiding legal penalties, and upholding ethical standards. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the project solely based on the positive cost-benefit analysis without adequately investigating the bribery risks. This failure to conduct thorough due diligence on the potential client and the operating environment would violate the spirit and letter of the UK Bribery Act 2010. It would also represent an ethical lapse, as it prioritizes profit over integrity and potentially exposes John Wood Group to significant legal and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that the client's local laws are sufficient protection, as the UK Bribery Act has extraterritorial reach and applies to the conduct of UK companies and individuals globally. Relying solely on local compliance without considering UK legal obligations is a critical error. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that integrates ethical considerations and regulatory compliance into the initial stages of business development. This involves a multidisciplinary review process where legal, compliance, and risk management teams are actively involved in evaluating new opportunities. The framework should mandate a go/no-go decision point based on the satisfactory mitigation of identified risks, rather than solely on financial projections. This ensures that business decisions are not only commercially viable, but also ethically sound and legally compliant. Question 6. Regulatory review indicates that John Wood Group has received an inquiry from the relevant UK Financial Regulatory Authority regarding potential undisclosed material information related to a significant project bid. The internal team is still in the process of verifying the details and assessing the full impact of the bid status. Which of the following actions best aligns with John Wood Group's regulatory obligations and professional conduct? Option A. Acknowledge the regulatory inquiry. Inform the authority that the information is under internal review for verification, and commit to providing a definitive update as soon as all facts are confirmed and assessed, in line with disclosure rules. Option B. Immediately issue a public statement confirming the bid status, even if preliminary, to satisfy the regulatory inquiry and manage market expectations. Option C. Withhold all information from the regulatory authority and the public until a definitive outcome of the bid is known, to avoid premature or potentially inaccurate disclosures. Option D. Issue a vague statement to the market suggesting that the company is aware of market speculation, but providing no specific details about the bid or the regulatory inquiry. The correct answer is B. Immediately issue a public statement confirming the bid status, even if preliminary, to satisfy the regulatory inquiry and manage market expectations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for positive public perception and the regulatory obligation to disclose material information accurately and without delay. John Wood Group, as a publicly listed entity, is subject to stringent reporting requirements designed to ensure market integrity and protect investors. The challenge lies in balancing the timing of public announcements with the need for thorough verification of information, especially when that information could significantly impact the company's share price. Careful judgment is required to avoid premature disclosure that could be misleading or incomplete, while also preventing undue delay that could be construed as market manipulation or a breach of disclosure obligations. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent engagement with the regulatory body, coupled with a commitment to providing accurate and timely information once verified. This demonstrates adherence to the spirit and letter of regulatory frameworks, prioritizing investor confidence and market fairness. Specifically, by acknowledging the inquiry and indicating the process for verification and disclosure, John Wood Group signals its commitment to compliance. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory oversight, which mandate that companies act in good faith and provide information that is not misleading. An incorrect approach of withholding information until a definitive, positive outcome is assured would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could be interpreted as an attempt to manage market perception rather than comply with disclosure duties, potentially leading to accusations of insider trading or market manipulation if material non-public information is selectively disseminated or withheld. Another incorrect approach of issuing a vague or speculative statement without concrete verification would also be problematic. This could mislead investors, create market volatility based on unconfirmed information, and breach the requirement for accurate and not misleading disclosures. Finally, ignoring the regulatory inquiry altogether would be a direct contravention of regulatory obligations, leading to severe penalties and reputational damage. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves establishing clear internal protocols for handling regulatory inquiries, ensuring prompt internal communication to gather and verify information, and consulting with legal and compliance teams. The framework should emphasize transparency, accuracy, and timeliness in all communications with regulators and the market. When faced with uncertainty, the default should be to err on the side of caution by seeking clarification and ensuring all disclosures are factually sound and compliant with applicable regulations. Question 7. Consider a scenario where an employee at John Wood Group, while working on a confidential project, becomes aware of a significant non-public contract award that is expected to substantially increase the company's share price upon public announcement. The employee has personal funds available and is considering purchasing shares in John Wood Group before the announcement. What is the most appropriate course of action for this employee? Strictly adhering to UK regulatory frameworks and SISI guidelines. Option A. Refrain from trading on the information and immediately report the situation and the potential conflict of interest to John Wood Group's compliance department. Option B. Disclose the information to a close friend who is an experienced investor, suggesting they consider investing in John Wood Group. Option C. Purchase shares in John Wood Group immediately, as the information is not yet public and represents a legitimate investment opportunity. Option D. Wait for the contract award to be publicly announced, and then purchase shares in John Wood Group. The correct answer is C. Purchase shares in John Wood Group immediately, as the information is not yet public and represents a legitimate investment opportunity. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at John Wood Group due to the inherent conflict between personal financial interests and the company's ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. Maintaining confidentiality and avoiding insider trading are paramount in the financial services industry, particularly when dealing with non-public information that could materially affect share prices. The employee's awareness of a significant upcoming contract award for John Wood Group constitutes price-sensitive information. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to internal company policies and relevant financial regulations, such as those governed by the UK Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and the principles outlined by the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, SISI. This means refraining from trading on the information and reporting the situation to the appropriate compliance department. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant because it prioritizes the integrity of the market and upholds the duty of trust owed to John Wood Group and its stakeholders. It prevents the employee from gaining an unfair advantage and avoids potential market manipulation or insider dealing, which are serious offenses under UK law and SISI conduct rules. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with purchasing shares in John Wood Group based on the anticipated contract award. This action constitutes insider dealing, a severe breach of both regulatory requirements, e.g., UK market abuse regulation and professional ethics. It exploits non-public information for personal gain, undermining market fairness and trust. Another incorrect approach would be to disclose this information to a friend or family member with the intention of them trading on it. This is also a form of insider dealing, as it facilitates the unlawful use of price-sensitive information and can lead to severe penalties for both the employee and the recipient of the information. A third incorrect approach would be to remain silent but feel conflicted and anxious, without taking any proactive steps to report or clarify the situation. While not an active breach, this passive inaction fails to uphold the professional responsibility to act with integrity and to report potential compliance issues, leaving the employee in a precarious ethical and potentially legal position. Professionals in such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Recognizing the nature of the information. Is it price-sensitive and non-public? 2. Consulting internal company policies and procedures regarding the handling of such information and personal trading. 3. Seeking guidance from the company's compliance department or legal counsel. 4. Acting in accordance with regulatory requirements and professional codes of conduct, even if it means foregoing a potential personal financial gain. Question 8. Process analysis reveals that John Wood Group is assessing a potential environmental remediation liability arising from historical operations. The company's internal assessment suggests a significant financial impact, but the exact quantification is complex and subject to ongoing expert evaluation. The board is concerned about the potential negative market reaction if this information is disclosed prematurely or without a clear understanding of the full scope of the liability. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical considerations for John Wood Group? Option A. Focus internal efforts on mitigating the environmental impact and resolving the issue before any public disclosure is made, to present a more positive outlook to investors. Option B. Delay disclosure until the expert evaluation is fully complete and a precise financial figure can be determined, to avoid market speculation and potential share price volatility. Option C. Proactively disclose the potential environmental liability, including a preliminary estimate and a commitment to provide further updates as the expert evaluation progresses, while engaging with relevant regulatory bodies. Option D. Disclose a general statement acknowledging potential environmental considerations without quantifying the specific liability, to manage market expectations without revealing sensitive details. The correct answer is C. Proactively disclose the potential environmental liability, including a preliminary estimate and a commitment to provide further updates as the expert evaluation progresses, while engaging with relevant regulatory bodies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in navigating the ethical and regulatory landscape of corporate reporting, specifically concerning the disclosure of potential environmental liabilities. John Wood Group, as a publicly listed entity, is bound by strict reporting requirements designed to ensure transparency and protect investor interests. The challenge lies in balancing the need for accurate and timely disclosure with the potential for negative market reaction and the company's strategic interests. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate level of detail and timing for disclosing such information, ensuring compliance with relevant regulations while maintaining stakeholder confidence. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent disclosure strategy, aligned with the UK's regulatory framework, particularly the UK Corporate Governance Code and the Financial Conduct Authority's (FCA) listing rules and disclosure guidance and transparency rules. This approach prioritizes providing stakeholders with sufficient information to make informed decisions. It acknowledges the potential environmental impact and its financial implications, seeking expert advice to quantify these risks accurately. The ethical imperative is to avoid misleading the market and to uphold the principle of transparency. Regulatory justification stems from the requirement for listed companies to disclose price-sensitive information promptly and accurately. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on minimizing immediate negative market impact by delaying or downplaying the disclosure would be professionally unacceptable. This failure would violate the FCA's rules on timely disclosure of inside information and could be construed as market abuse. Ethically, it represents a breach of trust with investors and other stakeholders. Another incorrect approach, which involves disclosing vague or unsubstantiated information without proper due diligence or expert assessment, also fails to meet regulatory standards. This lack of rigor can lead to inaccurate reporting, potentially causing further harm to the company's reputation and legal standing. It also fails to provide stakeholders with the meaningful information they require. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential reportable events, assessing their materiality and price sensitivity in consultation with legal and compliance teams, and then determining the most appropriate and timely disclosure method. This process should be guided by a commitment to regulatory compliance, ethical conduct, and the principle of providing clear, accurate, and comprehensive information to the market. Question 9. The investigation demonstrates that several senior employees at John Wood Group have been involved in discussions with a competitor regarding potential joint ventures, while simultaneously holding personal investments in that same competitor. This situation raises concerns about potential conflicts of interest and the misuse of confidential information. Considering the regulatory framework applicable to a UK-based company operating in a regulated sector, which of the following actions would be the most appropriate initial response for John Wood Group's compliance department? Option A. Immediately suspend the involved employees and initiate a formal disciplinary process based on the initial findings. Option B. Advise the employees to divest their investments in the competitor and cease discussions. Considering the matter resolved without further investigation, Option C. Issue a company-wide reminder about conflict of interest policies without specifically addressing the individuals involved, to avoid creating unnecessary alarm. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive and documented investigation into the nature of the discussions, the extent of the personal investments, and any potential breaches of John Wood Group's Code of Conduct and relevant UK regulations, while ensuring confidentiality and impartiality. The correct answer is A. Immediately suspend the involved employees and initiate a formal disciplinary process based on the initial findings. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where John Wood Group employees may have engaged in activities that could be perceived as conflicts of interest or breaches of ethical conduct. This is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of company policy, relevant regulations, assuming a UK/CISI jurisdiction for this assessment, and ethical principles to determine the appropriate course of action. The potential for reputational damage, legal repercussions, and erosion of stakeholder trust necessitates careful judgment. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective, and documented investigation into the alleged conduct, adhering strictly to John Wood Group's internal policies and relevant UK regulatory frameworks, such as those promoted by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and the principles of the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, CISI, Code of Conduct. This approach prioritizes gathering all facts, assessing them against established standards, and ensuring fair process for all involved. It upholds principles of integrity, transparency, and accountability, which are paramount in regulated industries. An incorrect approach that involves immediate disciplinary action without a proper investigation fails to uphold due process and could lead to unfair outcomes, potentially violating employment law and ethical standards. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the allegations due to their sensitive nature or potential impact on business relationships, constitutes a failure to act with integrity and diligence, potentially exposing John Wood Group to significant regulatory penalties and reputational harm. A third incorrect approach, which is to conduct a superficial review that does not fully explore the facts or consider all relevant policies and regulations, demonstrates a lack of professional competence and a disregard for the seriousness of the allegations, undermining the company's commitment to ethical conduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with acknowledging the allegation, followed by a commitment to a fair and thorough investigation. This involves consulting relevant internal policies and external regulations, gathering evidence objectively, interviewing relevant parties, and documenting all steps. The process should be guided by principles of fairness, proportionality, and integrity, ensuring that any conclusions are evidence-based and aligned with legal and ethical obligations. Question 10. The analysis reveals that an employee at John Wood Group, who is involved in procurement decisions, learns of a potential investment opportunity in a private company that is a current supplier to John Wood Group. The employee is considering making a personal investment in this supplier. Which of the following actions best adheres to the ethical and regulatory expectations for an employee of John Wood Group? Option A. Discuss the investment opportunity with a trusted colleague to gauge their opinion before making a decision. Option B. Research the supplier's financial performance independently and make the investment if the performance appears strong, without informing John Wood Group. Option C. Immediately disclose the potential investment opportunity and the personal interest to the designated compliance officer or line manager, following John Wood Group's internal conflict of interest policy. Option D. Proceed with the personal investment, assuming it is a minor amount and unlikely to influence procurement decisions. Correct answer is C. Immediately disclose the potential investment opportunity and the personal interest to the designated compliance officer or line manager, following John Wood Group's internal conflict of interest policy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at John Wood Group due to the potential conflict between personal interests and the company's ethical obligations. Navigating such situations requires a deep understanding of the company's code of conduct and relevant regulatory frameworks to ensure integrity and compliance. The core of the challenge lies in maintaining objectivity and avoiding any perception of impropriety, which could damage John Wood Group's reputation and lead to regulatory sanctions. The correct approach involves prioritizing John Wood Group's established ethical guidelines and reporting procedures. This means disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the appropriate internal channels, such as a line manager or the compliance department, as stipulated by the company's code of conduct. This proactive disclosure allows John Wood Group to manage the conflict appropriately, potentially by recusing the employee from relevant decision-making processes or implementing other safeguards. This aligns with the ethical imperative to act in the best interests of the employer and to uphold transparency, which is often a cornerstone of corporate governance and regulatory compliance in the UK, as guided by bodies like the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and the principles outlined by the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, CISI. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the personal investment without disclosure. This failure to report a potential conflict of interest breaches the trust placed in the employee by John Wood Group and violates the principles of integrity and accountability. Such an action could be seen as a breach of contract and a violation of the company's code of conduct, potentially leading to disciplinary action. Furthermore, depending on the nature of the investment and the employee's role, it could also contravene specific regulatory requirements related to insider dealing or market abuse, even if unintentional, if the information influencing the investment is non-public and material. Another incorrect approach would be to seek advice from a colleague outside of the designated reporting channels. While seeking advice is generally good practice, doing so from an unqualified or unauthorized source bypasses the formal internal control mechanisms designed to address conflicts of interest. This can lead to informal or potentially incorrect guidance, which does not absolve the employee of their responsibility to follow John Wood Group's official procedures and regulatory obligations. It also fails to create an auditable trail of how the conflict was managed. A third incorrect approach would be to assume that the personal investment is insignificant and therefore does not require disclosure. This is a dangerous assumption. Regulatory frameworks and company codes of conduct often have broad definitions of what constitutes a conflict of interest, and the perceived insignificance of an investment does not negate the potential for actual or perceived bias. The professional decision-making process should always err on the side of caution and transparency when dealing with potential conflicts of interest, adhering strictly to established policies and seeking clarification from the appropriate internal authorities. Question 11. Compliance review shows that a significant potential misstatement has been identified in the financial projections for a new contract being pursued by the John Wood Group. The sales team is eager to finalize the contract, as it represents a substantial revenue opportunity, and is suggesting that the misstatement be addressed after the contract is secured. Which of the following actions best upholds the John Wood Group's commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct? Option A. Proceed with finalizing the contract and address the potential misstatement internally at a later date, assuming it will not significantly impact the overall financial outcome. Option B. Immediately escalate the identified potential misstatement to the John Wood Group's internal compliance and legal departments for thorough investigation and appropriate action. Option C. Inform the client about the potential misstatement and propose a revised contract value before signing, without consulting internal compliance or legal teams. Option D. Instruct the sales team to adjust the projections to align with the perceived acceptable financial outcome, without formal review by compliance or legal. The correct answer is B. Immediately escalate the identified potential misstatement to the John Wood Group's internal compliance and legal departments for thorough investigation and appropriate action. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate potential conflicts between business objectives and regulatory compliance, specifically concerning the John Wood Group's adherence to UK financial regulations. The pressure to secure a new contract, coupled with the discovery of a potential misstatement, necessitates careful judgment to ensure that the company's financial reporting remains accurate and transparent, thereby upholding its legal and ethical obligations. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the issue to the appropriate internal compliance and legal departments. This is the professionally sound and ethically mandated course of action, because it ensures that the potential misstatement is reviewed by individuals with the expertise and authority to assess its materiality and determine the necessary corrective actions. Under UK financial regulations, such as those governed by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and the Companies Act 2006. Companies have a duty to maintain accurate financial records and to disclose material information. Failing to address a potential misstatement promptly and through the correct channels could lead to regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and legal liabilities for the John Wood Group. This approach prioritizes integrity and compliance over immediate business gains. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the contract without disclosing the potential misstatement, hoping it would be resolved later or deemed insignificant. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure because it constitutes a deliberate omission of potentially material information, which can mislead stakeholders and investors. It violates the principles of transparency and honesty fundamental to financial regulation. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to correct the misstatement internally without involving the designated compliance and legal teams. This bypasses established internal controls and may result in an inadequate or improperly documented correction, potentially masking the issue rather than resolving it effectively, and still failing to meet the company's disclosure obligations. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. This involves understanding the company's internal policies and procedures for reporting potential compliance breaches, identifying the relevant regulatory requirements, and escalating concerns through the designated channels without delay. The decision-making process should focus on protecting the integrity of the company's operations and financial reporting, even if it presents short-term business challenges. Question 12. To address the challenge of a John Wood Group employee who has come into possession of information that could significantly impact the company's share price, but is not yet publicly known, which of the following actions demonstrates the most responsible and compliant approach to potential disclosure? Option A. Immediately consult with the John Wood Group's compliance department or legal counsel to determine the appropriate course of action and regulatory obligations. Option B. Share the information with a close friend who works in a completely unrelated sector, assuming they would not act on it. Option C. Wait to see if the information becomes public knowledge through other channels before deciding whether to report it internally. Option D. Disclose the information directly to a trusted contact within the industry who might have insights into its market impact. The correct answer is A. Immediately consult with the John Wood Group's compliance department or legal counsel to determine the appropriate course of action and regulatory obligations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a John Wood Group employee regarding the appropriate disclosure of potentially material non-public information. The core difficulty lies in balancing the company's obligation to provide accurate and timely information to the market with the prohibition against insider trading. A misstep can lead to significant reputational damage, regulatory penalties for both the individual and the company, and erosion of investor confidence. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between general business discussions and the disclosure of information that could unfairly influence market decisions. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves seeking guidance from the John Wood Group's compliance department or legal counsel before making any disclosure. This is the most appropriate professional action because it directly adheres to established regulatory frameworks, such as the UK's Market Abuse Regulation, MAR, and the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA listing rules, which govern the disclosure of inside information. By consulting with the compliance function, the employee ensures that any potential disclosure is assessed against these regulations, determining if the information constitutes inside information and if a formal announcement is required. This process safeguards against inadvertent market abuse and upholds the company's commitment to fair and transparent market practices. It also aligns with ethical principles of integrity and accountability. Incorrect approaches analysis. Disclosing the information directly to a trusted industry contact without prior consultation is professionally unacceptable. This action risks violating MAR by potentially disseminating inside information to the market without the proper regulatory channels. The industry contact, even if trusted, is not an authorized recipient of such information, and their subsequent actions could lead to insider dealing. Sharing the information with a close friend who works in a different sector is also professionally unsound. While the friend may not directly trade on the information, the risk of indirect disclosure or the friend inadvertently revealing it to someone who could trade on it remains. This approach bypasses all internal controls and regulatory oversight designed to prevent market abuse. Waiting to see if the information becomes public knowledge before deciding to disclose it is a passive and risky strategy. The obligation to disclose material information rests with the company, and delaying action based on speculation about public awareness does not absolve the employee or the company of their responsibilities. This inaction could be interpreted as an attempt to circumvent disclosure rules, leading to regulatory scrutiny and penalties. Professional reasoning. Professionals at John Wood Group should adopt a proactive and compliance-driven decision-making process when encountering potentially material non-public information. This involves 1. Identifying the nature of the information. Is it specific, non-public, and likely to have a significant impact on the company's share price if disclosed? 2. Consulting internal policies and procedures. Familiarize oneself with John Wood Group's policies on market abuse, insider dealing, and disclosure. 3. Escalating to the appropriate internal authority. Immediately report the information to the compliance department, legal counsel, or a designated senior manager responsible for regulatory compliance. 4. Following guidance. Adhere strictly to the advice provided by the compliance function regarding disclosure or non-disclosure. 5. Documenting the process. Keep a record of the information, the consultation, and the guidance received. This structured approach ensures that all actions are aligned with regulatory requirements and ethical standards, protecting both the individual and the company. Question 13. The review process indicates that a senior manager at John Wood Group, responsible for approving significant supplier contracts, has a close personal relationship with a key executive at a company bidding for a major contract. The manager is aware of this relationship and its potential to influence their professional judgment. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the senior manager to uphold John Wood Group's ethical standards and regulatory obligations? Option A. Inform the executive from the bidding company that they will be recusing themselves from the process due to their personal relationship, but do not formally report this to John Wood Group management. Option B. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to the designated compliance officer or relevant senior management within John Wood Group and recuse themselves from all discussions and decision-making related to the supplier contract. Option C. Proceed with the evaluation and approval of the contract, assuming that the personal relationship will not influence their professional objectivity. Option D. Discuss the situation informally with the executive from the bidding company to ensure the relationship does not impact professional judgment, and then proceed with the evaluation of the contract. The correct answer is B. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to the designated compliance officer or relevant senior management within John Wood Group and recuse themselves from all discussions and decision-making related to the supplier contract. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at John Wood Group to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure compliance with internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks, specifically those governing financial conduct and corporate governance within the UK. The core of the challenge lies in maintaining objectivity and integrity when personal relationships might influence professional judgment or create the appearance of impropriety. Careful judgment is required to uphold ethical standards and prevent any actions that could undermine trust or lead to regulatory breaches. The correct approach involves a transparent and proactive disclosure of the personal relationship to the relevant internal authority at John Wood Group, followed by recusal from any decision-making processes that could be influenced by this relationship. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and ethical conduct expected under UK regulations, such as those promoted by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, for financial services firms and general principles of company law regarding directors' duties and conflicts of interest. By disclosing and recusing, the individual demonstrates a commitment to integrity, avoids actual or perceived conflicts, and ensures that decisions are made impartially, thereby protecting John Wood Group from potential reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny. An incorrect approach of proceeding with the decision without disclosure or recusal would constitute a significant ethical failure. It breaches the fundamental duty of loyalty and good faith owed to the employer and could violate internal conflict of interest policies. From a regulatory perspective, such an action could be seen as a failure to manage conflicts of interest effectively, potentially leading to sanctions if the decision-making process is deemed compromised. Another incorrect approach of discussing the matter informally with the involved party, without formal disclosure to John Wood Group management, is also professionally unacceptable. While it might seem like a way to manage the situation, it bypasses established governance procedures and fails to create an auditable record of conflict management. This approach leaves the company vulnerable as there is no formal acknowledgement or mitigation of the conflict. A third incorrect approach of assuming the personal relationship has no bearing on professional judgment, even without disclosure, is a dangerous assumption. Professional ethics and regulations often focus on the appearance of impropriety as much as the actual existence of a conflict. Failing to disclose and recuse creates a perception of bias, which can be as damaging as actual bias, and can still lead to regulatory concerns about the integrity of John Wood Group's operations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of John Wood Group's internal policies on conflicts of interest and ethical conduct. When a potential conflict arises, the individual should first identify the nature of the conflict and its potential impact. The next step is to consult relevant policies and seek guidance from the appropriate internal department, e.g., legal, compliance, or HR. The paramount principle is transparency and adherence to established procedures for disclosure and mitigation, ensuring that all actions are defensible from both an ethical and regulatory standpoint. Question 14. What factors determine whether an employee at John Wood Group can proceed with a personal investment in a publicly traded company when they possess non-public information about a potential contract award that could significantly impact the target company's share price? Option A. The employee's belief that their investment will not influence the market or the outcome of the contract. Option B. The official guidance from John Wood Group's compliance department and adherence to relevant financial conduct regulations. Option C. The employee's personal assessment of the information's materiality and the likelihood of it becoming public soon. Option D. The employee's seniority within John Wood Group and their direct involvement in the contract negotiation process. The correct answer is C. The employee's personal assessment of the information's materiality and the likelihood of it becoming public soon. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at John Wood Group due to the inherent conflict between personal financial interests and the company's ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for insider information to be misused, leading to unfair market advantages and breaches of trust. Navigating this requires a robust understanding of internal policies and external regulations governing financial conduct. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to John Wood Group's code of conduct and relevant financial regulations, such as those enforced by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK. This means proactively seeking clarification from the compliance department regarding any potential conflicts of interest and refraining from trading until clearance is obtained. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant as it upholds the principles of fair dealing, prevents market abuse, and protects the company's reputation. It aligns with the FCA's principles for businesses and individuals, particularly those concerning market integrity and preventing insider dealing. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the trade without seeking guidance, assuming personal knowledge of the information's materiality or public availability. This carries significant regulatory risk, as even an unintentional breach of insider trading rules can result in severe penalties, including fines and imprisonment, as stipulated by the Criminal Justice Act 1993 and FCA rules. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on informal advice from colleagues, as this lacks the authority and comprehensive understanding of regulatory nuances that the compliance department provides. This can lead to misinterpretations of policy and regulation, exposing both the individual and the company to risk. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that emphasizes a proactive, risk-averse, and compliance-oriented mindset. When faced with a potential conflict of interest or uncertainty regarding financial dealings, the first step should always be to consult the company's internal policies and designated compliance officers. This ensures that any action taken is informed by the most accurate and up-to-date regulatory and ethical guidance. If there is any doubt, the principle of when in doubt, don't should be applied, deferring any action until full clarity and approval are secured. Question 15. System analysis indicates that a John Wood Group employee receives an email from a senior manager containing details about a potential significant contract win that has not yet been publicly announced. The employee is considering purchasing shares in John Wood Group based on this information. Which of the following actions best adheres to regulatory requirements and professional ethics for John Wood Group employees? Option A. Verify the information's public status through official John Wood Group announcements or the FCA's regulatory news service and refrain from trading until confirmed public. Option B. Immediately purchase shares in John Wood Group, assuming the information is accurate and will positively impact the share price. Option C. Discuss the information with other colleagues in different departments to gauge their awareness and potential trading plans. Option D. Assume the information is public because it was shared by a senior manager and proceed with purchasing shares. Correct answer is B. Immediately purchase shares in John Wood Group, assuming the information is accurate and will positively impact the share price. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in navigating the ethical and regulatory landscape surrounding insider information within John Wood Group. The core difficulty lies in distinguishing between legitimate, publicly available information and material non-public information that, if acted upon, could constitute market abuse. The requirement for careful judgment stems from the potential for reputational damage and legal repercussions for both the individual and the company if such regulations are breached. The correct approach involves a rigorous process of information verification and adherence to John Wood Group's internal policies and relevant UK financial regulations, specifically the UK Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) Handbook, particularly MAR, Market Abuse Regulation. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes compliance and ethical conduct. By seeking clarification from the compliance department and refraining from any trading until the information is confirmed as public, the individual demonstrates a commitment to upholding regulatory standards and preventing insider dealing. This aligns with the FCA's objective of maintaining market integrity and investor confidence. An incorrect approach of acting on the information immediately without verification is professionally unacceptable due to direct contravention of MAR. This regulation prohibits the disclosure of inside information and the undertaking of transactions based on it. Such an action constitutes insider dealing, a serious offense with severe penalties. Another incorrect approach of discussing the information with colleagues who are not authorized to receive it, even without trading, is also professionally flawed. This constitutes unlawful disclosure of inside information, a breach of MAR and John Wood Group's internal confidentiality policies, potentially leading to market manipulation and undermining fair market practices. Finally, an incorrect approach of assuming the information is public because it was shared by a senior manager without independent verification is also professionally unsound. While a senior manager might have access to information, its public dissemination status requires confirmation, and assumptions can lead to inadvertent breaches of regulatory obligations. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that emphasizes a precautionary principle when dealing with potentially sensitive information. This involves a systematic process of 1. Identifying potentially material non-public information. 2. Consulting internal policies and seeking guidance from the compliance department. 3. Verifying the public availability of information through official channels. 4. Refraining from any action that could be construed as market abuse until absolute certainty regarding the information's status is achieved. Question 16. The assessment process reveals that a candidate for a senior engineering role at John Wood Group has claimed extensive experience in managing compliance with UK offshore safety regulations. However, their responses during the interview regarding specific incident reporting procedures and the application of the Control of Major Accident Hazards (COMA) regulations appear vague. Which approach best demonstrates professional due diligence in evaluating this candidate's suitability for John Wood Group? Option A. Immediately disqualify the candidate due to the perceived vagueness in their responses, without seeking further clarification or evidence of their practical application of UK offshore safety regulations. Option B. Focus on the candidate's technical engineering skills and overlook the nuances of their regulatory compliance experience, assuming they can learn specific procedures on the job. Option C. Request specific examples of how the candidate has applied COMA regulations in previous roles and ask detailed situational questions about incident reporting and investigation protocols relevant to UK offshore operations. Option D. Acknowledge the candidate's general enthusiasm for safety and assume their experience is sufficient, given the seniority of the role they are applying for at John Wood Group. The correct answer is C. Request specific examples of how the candidate has applied COMA regulations in previous roles and ask detailed situational questions about incident reporting and investigation protocols relevant to UK offshore operations. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where a candidate for John Wood Group has presented information that, while seemingly positive, may be misleading or incomplete regarding their experience with a specific regulatory compliance framework relevant to the energy sector. This presents a professional challenge because it requires the assessor to discern genuine competence from potentially exaggerated claims, ensuring that John Wood Group hires individuals who can uphold its commitment to regulatory adherence and ethical conduct. Careful judgment is required to avoid both overlooking a strong candidate and hiring someone who might pose a compliance risk. The correct approach involves a thorough, evidence-based verification of the candidate's claims, focusing on their understanding and practical application of the relevant UK regulatory framework, e.g., Health and Safety Executive, HSE, regulations, environmental protection legislation, and industry-specific codes of practice applicable to offshore energy operations. This means probing for specific examples, asking situational questions that require the candidate to articulate their decision-making process in compliance-related scenarios, and cross-referencing their stated experience with verifiable achievements or references. This approach is professionally sound because it directly aligns with the duty of care John Wood Group has to operate within legal and ethical boundaries, as mandated by UK law and professional standards. It ensures that the candidate possesses the requisite knowledge and practical skills to contribute to the company's compliance objectives, thereby mitigating risks of regulatory breaches, reputational damage, and potential legal liabilities. An incorrect approach would be to accept the candidate's self-assessment at face value without further scrutiny. This fails to uphold the professional responsibility to conduct due diligence, potentially leading to the hiring of an unqualified individual. It also risks misrepresenting the candidate's capabilities to internal stakeholders, which is ethically questionable. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the candidate based on a minor discrepancy without seeking clarification or further evidence. This could lead to the loss of a potentially valuable employee and is professionally unfair. A third incorrect approach might involve focusing solely on the candidate's enthusiasm or perceived potential without adequately assessing their concrete understanding of the regulatory landscape. While enthusiasm is valuable, it cannot substitute for demonstrable competence in critical compliance areas. Professionals should employ a structured, objective, and evidence-driven assessment process. This involves defining clear criteria for evaluating compliance knowledge and experience, using a mix of interview techniques, behavioral, situational, and, where appropriate, requesting supporting documentation or references. The decision-making process should prioritize factual verification and a balanced assessment of both strengths and potential weaknesses, always with the company's regulatory obligations and ethical standards as the guiding principles. Question 17. Process analysis reveals that John Wood Group is considering a new client engagement where the prospective client has expressed a strong interest in a particular high-risk investment product without providing detailed financial information. Which approach best aligns with the John Wood Group's regulatory obligations under the FCA Handbook and professional ethical standards? Option A. Inform the client that due to their limited financial disclosure, John Wood Group cannot provide any investment advice at this time and terminate the engagement. Option B. Recommend a diversified portfolio of low-risk investments to mitigate potential losses, even though this deviates from the client's stated interest in the high-risk product. Option C. Proceed with recommending the high-risk investment product, emphasizing its potential for high returns, while assuring the client that their interest is the primary driver for the recommendation. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive fact-finding exercise to understand the client's full financial situation, risk tolerance, investment objectives, and knowledge of investments before making any product recommendations. The correct answer is C. Proceed with recommending the high-risk investment product, emphasizing its potential for high returns, while assuring the client that their interest is the primary driver for the recommendation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in navigating the ethical and regulatory landscape of financial advisory services within the UK, specifically concerning the John Wood Group's potential engagement with a new client. The core difficulty lies in balancing the imperative to secure new business with the stringent requirements of the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA Handbook, particularly Cobb's Conduct of Business Sourcebook, and APER, per professional ethics. A key consideration is the duty to act honestly, fairly, and professionally in accordance with the best interests of clients, which includes avoiding conflicts of interest and ensuring adequate due diligence. The correct approach involves a thorough and documented assessment of the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance, aligned with the John Wood Group's regulatory obligations under the FCA. This includes understanding the client's knowledge and experience in the relevant investment field, as mandated by Cobb's 9.2.1r. The process must also consider the potential for conflicts of interest, as outlined in APER 3.1.2r, and ensure that any advice provided is suitable and in the client's best interests, avoiding any misrepresentation or undue pressure. This diligent, client-centric, and compliant approach is paramount for maintaining regulatory adherence and professional integrity. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate client acquisition over thorough assessment would fail to meet FCA standards. For instance, proceeding with recommendations without a comprehensive understanding of the client's financial standing and risk appetite, as required by Cobb's 9, would be a significant regulatory and ethical breach. This could lead to unsuitable advice, potential client detriment, and subsequent regulatory sanctions against both the individual advisor and the John Wood Group. Another flawed approach might involve downplaying or ignoring potential conflicts of interest, such as undisclosed personal incentives, which directly contravenes APER 3.1.2r and undermines client trust and the firm's reputation. Furthermore, making assumptions about the client's needs or the suitability of specific products without proper investigation is a failure of professional duty and regulatory compliance. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of their regulatory obligations under the FCA Handbook. This involves a systematic process of client onboarding that prioritizes information gathering, risk assessment, and conflict identification. Any proposed course of action must be evaluated against the principles of acting with integrity, skill, care, and diligence, and in the best interests of the client. If any doubt arises regarding compliance or suitability, seeking guidance from senior management or the compliance department is essential before proceeding. Question 18. System analysis indicates that a new offshore wind farm development project for John Wood Group requires a comprehensive risk assessment. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations and professional risk management best practices for identifying and evaluating potential project risks? Option A. Delegate the entire risk assessment process to the most junior team members to foster their development, with minimal senior oversight. Option B. Rely solely on risk registers from previous unrelated offshore projects, assuming that all relevant risks will be captured. Option C. Prioritize risk identification and assessment by focusing on the most significant potential threats and opportunities, using a phased approach that analyzes likelihood and impact to inform mitigation strategies. Option D. Conduct a detailed, exhaustive review of every conceivable minor risk, regardless of its potential impact or likelihood, to ensure no risk is overlooked. The correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed, exhaustive review of every conceivable minor risk, regardless of its potential impact or likelihood, to ensure no risk is overlooked. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a John Wood Group employee tasked with identifying and assessing risks associated with a new project. The challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough risk identification with the practical constraints of project timelines and resource availability. A failure to adequately identify and assess risks can lead to significant financial, operational, and reputational damage for John Wood Group, potentially violating regulatory obligations related to safety, environmental protection, and corporate governance. Conversely, an overly cautious or exhaustive approach could unnecessarily delay project initiation and increase costs. Therefore, careful judgment is required to ensure a proportionate and effective risk assessment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and phased risk assessment process that prioritizes risks based on their potential impact and likelihood. This typically begins with a high-level identification of potential risks across various categories, e.g., technical, operational, financial, environmental, safety, regulatory. Subsequently, these identified risks are analyzed to understand their potential consequences and the probability of their occurrence. This analysis informs the prioritization, allowing the team to focus resources on mitigating the most significant risks first. This approach aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and risk management expected of companies like John Wood Group, ensuring compliance with relevant UK regulations, e.g., health and safety at work, etc. Act 1974, environmental legislation and industry best practices, which mandate a proactive and proportionate approach to risk management. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on documenting every conceivable minor risk without prioritization would be professionally unacceptable. This is because it diverts resources from addressing critical threats, potentially leading to a false sense of security, while major risks remain unmitigated. It also fails to adhere to the principle of proportionality in risk management, which is often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory frameworks. An approach that relies entirely on historical data from previous, dissimilar projects without considering the unique context of the new project would also be flawed. While historical data can be a valuable input, each project has its own specific risks and operating environment. Ignoring project-specific factors could lead to the overlooking of novel or amplified risks, potentially violating regulatory requirements for project-specific risk assessments. Finally, an approach that delegates the entire risk assessment process to junior staff without adequate oversight or senior review would be professionally negligent. This could result in a superficial or incomplete assessment, failing to leverage the experience and expertise necessary to identify and evaluate complex risks. This abdication of responsibility could lead to breaches of duty of care and regulatory noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals at John Wood Group should adopt a structured and iterative risk management framework. This involves 1. Understanding the project's objectives and scope. 2. Establishing a risk management plan that defines the methodology, roles, and responsibilities. 3. Conducting risk identification workshops and brainstorming sessions involving relevant stakeholders. 4. Analyzing and evaluating identified risks, considering their likelihood and impact. 5. Prioritizing risks to focus mitigation efforts on those with the highest potential consequences. 6. Developing and implementing risk response strategies. 7. Monitoring and reviewing risks throughout the project lifecycle. This systematic process ensures that risks are managed effectively and efficiently, in line with regulatory expectations and the company's commitment to responsible operations. Question 19. System analysis indicates that John Wood Group is commencing a new offshore platform decommissioning phase. A senior engineer, citing extensive prior experience with similar projects, suggests bypassing the formal, documented risk assessment process for certain routine tasks, arguing it will significantly speed up the initial mobilization. What is the most professionally responsible course of action for the project manager to take? Option A. Delegate the responsibility of risk assessment for routine tasks entirely to the senior engineer, trusting their judgment and experience to ensure safety without formal company oversight. Option B. Proceed with the formal, documented risk assessment for all tasks, including those deemed routine, ensuring all potential hazards and mitigation strategies are identified and approved before mobilization. Option C. Accept the senior engineer's recommendation to bypass formal risk assessment for routine tasks to expedite mobilization, relying on the engineer's experience to manage any unforeseen issues. Option D. Conduct a brief, informal discussion with the senior engineer to confirm their assessment of risks for routine tasks, without formal documentation, and proceed with mobilization. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the formal, documented risk assessment for all tasks, including those deemed routine, ensuring all potential hazards and mitigation strategies are identified and approved before mobilization. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for John Wood Group employees due to the inherent conflict between identifying potential risks and the pressure to maintain project momentum or meet deadlines. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for overlooking critical safety or environmental concerns if risk assessment is not conducted thoroughly and impartially. Adherence to regulatory frameworks is paramount to ensure the safety of personnel, the public, and the environment, as well as to maintain the company's reputation and legal standing. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of identifying, analyzing, and evaluating risks associated with a proposed project phase. This includes considering all potential hazards, assessing their likelihood and impact, and developing appropriate mitigation strategies. This approach is justified by regulatory requirements, such as those mandated by the Health and Safety Executive, HSE, in the UK, which require employers to conduct suitable and sufficient risk assessments to identify and control risks to health and safety. Ethically, it aligns with the professional duty of care owed to employees and the public. An incorrect approach of downplaying or ignoring identified risks to expedite project timelines would represent a significant regulatory failure. This directly contravenes the legal obligation to manage risks effectively and could lead to breaches of health and safety legislation, resulting in severe penalties, including fines and potential prosecution. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for the well-being of individuals and the environment, undermining professional integrity. Another incorrect approach, that of relying solely on past experience without formal documentation or re-evaluation, is also professionally unacceptable. While experience is valuable, it does not absolve individuals or the company from the regulatory requirement to conduct formal risk assessments for each specific project or phase. This can lead to overlooking new or evolving risks that may not have been present in previous projects. It also fails to provide an auditable trail for regulatory compliance and internal review. A further incorrect approach, which is to delegate the entire risk assessment process to a single individual without adequate oversight or review, poses a risk of bias or incomplete analysis. While individuals may have expertise, regulatory frameworks often imply a need for a robust process that may involve multiple perspectives and a formal review mechanism to ensure comprehensiveness and accuracy. This can lead to a failure to identify all relevant risks or to adequately assess their severity. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, clearly define the scope of the activity or project phase requiring assessment. Second, systematically identify all potential hazards, considering operational, environmental, and human factors. Third, analyze the likelihood and potential consequences of each identified hazard. Fourth, evaluate the risks and determine if existing controls are adequate or if further mitigation measures are necessary. Fifth, document the entire process, including identified risks, control measures, and responsibilities. Finally, ensure regular review and update of the risk assessment as circumstances change. Question 20. Market research demonstrates that John Wood Group is considering expanding its operations into a new region with a developing regulatory framework for energy infrastructure projects. The company must conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to ensure compliance and operational integrity. Which of the following approaches best addresses the regulatory complexities and potential risks associated with this expansion? Option A. Conduct a risk assessment that prioritizes adherence to the most stringent applicable regulations from both John Wood Group's home jurisdiction, UK, and the new market's developing framework, identifying any discrepancies and implementing mitigation strategies that satisfy the highest standards. Option B. Prioritize the risk assessment on identifying the lowest compliance costs associated with the new market's regulations to ensure financial efficiency. Option C. Focus the risk assessment solely on the regulations of the new market, assuming they represent the minimum acceptable standards for operation. Option D. Adopt a generic, globally applicable risk assessment template without specific consideration for the unique regulatory nuances of the new region or John Wood Group's home jurisdiction. Correct answer is A. Conduct a risk assessment that prioritizes adherence to the most stringent applicable regulations from both John Wood Group's home jurisdiction UK and the new market's developing framework, identifying any discrepancies and implementing mitigation strategies that satisfy the highest standards. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because John Wood Group, as a global energy services company, operates in diverse regulatory environments. The core difficulty lies in identifying and applying the correct risk assessment framework when faced with a new market entry that has potentially conflicting or overlapping regulatory requirements. A robust risk assessment is crucial for ensuring compliance, protecting the company's reputation, and safeguarding its financial interests. The professional must exercise careful judgment to avoid misinterpreting or misapplying regulations, which could lead to significant legal and operational consequences. The correct approach involves a systematic and comprehensive risk assessment that prioritizes adherence to the most stringent applicable regulations, particularly those related to environmental impact and worker safety, which are often heavily regulated in the energy sector. This approach ensures that John Woodward Group not only meets, but potentially exceeds minimum legal requirements, demonstrating a commitment to responsible operations. Specifically, this would involve a detailed review of UK regulations, as John Wood Group is a UK-domiciled company and often operates under UK standards, and any specific local regulations in the target market, identifying any gaps or conflicts, and developing mitigation strategies that satisfy the highest standards. This aligns with ethical principles of due diligence and corporate responsibility and regulatory expectations for companies to proactively manage risks. An incorrect approach of solely relying on the regulations of the new market without considering John Wood Group's home jurisdiction standards could lead to a failure to meet higher ethical or safety benchmarks expected of a company of its stature, potentially resulting in reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny from its home country. Another incorrect approach, focusing only on the perceived lowest common denominator of regulations to minimize immediate compliance costs, is ethically unsound and legally risky. It ignores the potential for stricter enforcement or the discovery of unforeseen liabilities, and it fails to uphold the company's duty of care to its employees and the environment. A third incorrect approach, applying a generic, nonspecific risk assessment methodology without tailoring it to the unique regulatory landscape of both the home country and the new market, would likely result in a superficial analysis that misses critical compliance obligations and potential risks. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the scope of the risk assessment, identifying all relevant jurisdictions and their respective regulatory frameworks. This should be followed by a thorough analysis of potential risks, prioritizing them based on likelihood and impact, and then developing specific, actionable mitigation plans. Regular review and updating of the risk assessment are essential, especially as regulations evolve or market conditions change.